Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's recording of my journey to a consultancy offer. We are thrilled to be joined by Harry Bickerstaffe today, who's going to talk us through his journey, where he's been. If you are new to the series, please have a look on our YouTube channel and also, importantly, on our Catch Up on Past Talks page, which you'll need your CRS ID for on the Careers Service channel. And we will be talking through in all of those videos the questions that Harry and I are going to talk through today, so you can get lots of different perspectives. You can also download all of our other resources on the Consultancy A to Z page or have a look through this series here. If you need to download any guides or have a look at any events, you can find those on Handshake. So we are really thrilled to have Harry with us. And Harry, if you could just introduce yourself, give us a little bit about your background and also the type of role that you're going to be undertaking.
Okay. Hi, Emily. It's great to see you again, and thanks again for your advice earlier when I was applying. So my background. I studied undergraduate medicine. I took a year out to study a master's in therapeutics, and then I came back and applied to life sciences consulting. And throughout undergrad and postgrad, I worked a number of research and consultancy projects and had a small number of key roles in societies. And now I'm joining a large life sciences consultancy as associate consultant in their London office.
Brilliant, thank you. And the kind of journey and research journey you've been on, I think, is a little bit more unique to some of the other people that I've spoken to. So I'm really looking forward to kind of delving into that. But I think the first place to start with, Harry, is how you actually went about researching firms to apply to, because you're going to work in life sciences, but I don't believe that that was the only type of firm that you looked at.
That's right. So I knew, I think from the start, that I wanted to work in life sciences or healthcare consulting, but I applied to some generalist consultancies who also had a significant amount of life sciences work. And I think I'll talk a bit later about the differences between those two, but researching the firms generally were three main parts, really. The websites, events, and people. So from websites, I think that was the first way of researching, both the Cambridge website, getting a list, kind of systematically looking at what's out there, and then looking at those company websites to see what their work is like, what their culture is like, etc. And I'll talk more about that later. Secondly, then events were the events were really helpful actually in getting an insight into what companies were like, the people they like to hire, how they were, the work they conduct, the notable projects they were particularly proud of, and how they related to students. I thought was really, and what they offered to students as well were all really important to my research. And thirdly, but most importantly, the people I talked to were key. So talking to current employees and sometimes past employees, or getting other competitor individual views on those companies were all really helpful. Knowing perhaps why someone left, knowing how someone finds it, or knowing how the company is in standing compared to other competitors were all really helpful. And those chats could be through LinkedIn, kind of cold emailing someone who I had some connection to, through friends of friends, or through networking, perhaps on my course or society work, etc. And those were really, really useful chats. And sometimes they led to those employees then helping me apply to the firm and give me insight into what was best to do. So those three things really let me rank the firms and organize my applications, and also to tailor all of my application documents specifically to those firms.
I think an important thing that you've mentioned is the way that people talk about their firm is really important. And I think you can get that intuitively from events and things, but more so from people who, consultancies renowned for people who stay a shorter time and move on. And actually that's expected and there's nothing wrong with that. So, you know, finding out what people did afterwards and how they view their time, about how that's helped them with their next step is a really kind of mature way of looking at how you would spend your time with a firm. Of course, there's people who stay there a long time. When
Yeah,
you talk to,
on that point, actually, I found it, as I was talking to more people, latterly I was finding it was really helpful to ask about what people had done before, say in previous consultancies, why they'd left, and what their next step was, what they were planning, and how good their, say, exit options were, or if they, say, plan never to leave because they really enjoyed it so much.
yes, and it's about reaching that, if you want to, if you see yourself reaching that seniority in the firm as well, because it's sometimes just not the move for somebody. Just to dig a little bit more deeper into events, I think in this virtual world, that's come to mean so many things now. We've been very used to careers fairs, dinners sometimes, case workshops, and company presentations, but that's evolved. Could I ask how you found what types of events you actually found
Yeah.
useful, and perhaps how you were able to maximize your time in those events or kind of get the most out of them?
Yeah, so I went to a number of events pre-COVID and then quite a few while I was applying during COVID. So I think the key change, I suppose, with virtual events, they could sometimes be fairly impersonal because they'd be larger. Typically, there wouldn't really be particular audience interaction, if it was very limited. So it was also easier to zone out during those calls. So I found it most useful to write some notes, just key words, key cases they'd mentioned, key points in the application process or work they enjoyed, or things which consultants could go on to do, and perhaps key names of people there, so I could write that down or contact them later. Those were all really useful. And then from some of those virtual events, I could then go into smaller sort of group events, virtual group events. Those typically would require a CV to apply, but those are very useful. Some of the group cases there were helpful. It's a little artificial sometimes, but then from some of those events, I then, with one company in particular, I joined a mentorship scheme, which became available from attending that event. And then that was very helpful with having one-to-one calls, and actually that group of other students as well. We formed a very nice network, and it was one of the most invaluable parts actually of the application process, was having that group of people who were going through the same steps and had the same interests, and I could practice with, and we could learn from each other. So that was really invaluable. Pre-COVID, it was easier, I think, to get that networking, to get that one-to-one conversation going, and perhaps build up those connections, to either have a follow-up call, perhaps gain a referral, perhaps practice a case or an interview. And so I think that was the advantage of the in-person pre-COVID event.
Well, thanks for sharing that, because I think the important thing is for anybody, whatever stage they're at in trying to research, but also apply and even get into firms and build a network, is not to see events as standalone things, but actually part of an environment that you're building for yourself. And I think, trying to be as active and interactive in those events is important, as well as taking the names that you mentioned and following up with people, and kind of trying to build a network, particularly if you've got no network existing. So that's what we've called a kind of strong kind of overview of the resources. There's a lot out there for consultancy. So what were your top recommendations for practical resources that candidates could use?
Okay, as you say, there's quite a lot. So perhaps if I talk through the process of applications, so starting with CVs, then tests, cases, and then more behavioural interviews. So starting with CV and cover letter. The Cambridge Guide, both the undergraduate and the postgraduate guides, were the most useful resource. I'm not just saying that because of the conversation we're having. They were very useful, and particularly using both guides together helped me bring in, say, my research experience, how best to leverage that, and also from the undergrad side. Then second to that, going back to events, some consultancies, particularly larger one, would hold CV events, and those were useful, particularly when they are smaller, perhaps requiring a CV in the first place to apply, and then getting that constructive feedback, typically quite harsh feedback, but very useful feedback was really valuable from those events. And then on the same kind of vein, that mentorship, whether it's informal or formal, and from someone perhaps who's a consultant themselves, used to be, or is through the process of applying, those were really helpful in getting that honest, constructive feedback on CVs, and particularly making it company specific. So if it's possible to have someone at the company review it, that's ideal, although that can be quite an ask sometimes if you've established a relationship, since so many people will be asking. So hence the events can be very useful. But finding from the websites of each company what they're looking for, and from events what the key criteria they're looking at are, those are all really helpful in tailoring the CV and cover letter. And as we mentioned before, with perhaps dropping in names if those people are happy for that, that you've talked to, that can sometimes help as well.
I think a really important thing you said there is about the kind of the number of resources that are available to you, but the quality really comes from if you can get review or interaction, if you can get criticism, but from the right people.
Yeah.
So somebody in the know. I think sometimes what can happen is people can get a friend or or maybe too many people to look at their documents, and actually it can add a little bit of pressure and stress. So I think a really good resource is people choosing your resources wisely. So choosing, kind of assessing them for their quality, just as you would for any academic resource.
Yeah, and my CV changed so many times. It must have been 20, 30 times through that application period. But it stayed largely as it was, I think, from using the Cambridge Guide, talking to the careers team, and then getting some good feedback from a couple of people I trusted in industry. But then throughout with other consultants and so on, it kept changing, and I think that was a positive thing. But definitely just choosing the right ones, otherwise it can go off in all directions.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked about some resources. Another one you picked up on there right at the beginning was the websites. And actually, I have to say, speaking to kind of a few hundred people a year, the websites are probably the least used resource. So the careers pages, the interview preparation pages, the advice pages, the values pages, they're not visited enough. So yes, there are the graduate careers pages, but there's also a lot of pages on preparing for interview, lots of pages on their values, their mission statements. So getting used to all of it is very useful. So, and particularly the larger firms, they offer their own case examples, etc., etc. So if you don't know where to start, or you feel a bit lost, the firm's website can be very useful for the larger firms. Like the smaller ones sometimes aren't as developed, but that's probably underutilized.
Absolutely. And one firm in particular based their final round interview questions off their core values, which were all listed on the website. So that was it was very helpful to have reviewed those beforehand.
Great. Because at the end of the day, most firms don't want to make it difficult for you. They actually want to have an enjoyable time interviewing you and to make it easy. So that's why the resources are there. And so if it seems obvious that, well, they've given the values, that can't be what they're going to interview on, sometimes it is, because you go through so many multiple stages. And actually talking about the resources, but then the ways that you use them, what type of application, because you applied to a number of different types of firms, what types of application process did you go through, and did you notice that you got further along in some than others?
Yeah, so I applied to life sciences specific consultancies, a couple of healthcare specific ones, so more dealing with, say, hospital work, and then a number of generalist consultancies who also had large life sciences branches within their work. I think in total I applied to about 15 or so, staggered in my applications throughout a couple of months. And roughly, so CV screen was always first, CV, and then typically a cover letter screen. Sometimes that was optional. And I got through, I was fortunate to get through all of those CV and cover letter screens. Then the next stage was quite normally a fairly broad stroke tool, and that was typically a test or some form of test like that. One used a one-way video presentation, which was recorded beforehand. And those tests, testing maths, logic, verbal reasoning, those typical sorts of things. And I'll perhaps circle back around to some of those resources for those as well. And I think I failed two of those ones, particularly when they were very time pressured for the mathematics part. So I failed on two of those, then went through to the next stage, which was a first round interview. Sometimes that was with HR, just a phone call, again, trying to cut down those number of applications really. And other firms, it was more of a standardized interview set, 2-3 interviews perhaps on a day, typically very standardized, normally blinded, which came with its own problems, or problems for me, I suppose, which I'll talk about a bit later. And typically structured cases, which were fairly standard. And then you'd find out a week or so later if you got through to the final round stage. And I got through, of my about the 10 which I went through, I went to about 2 final round interviews. Again, those were quite long processes, 3, 4, 5 interviews in a day. Much more, I say much more fun, actually, those ones. It was more of a conversation. They tended to be less standardized. They weren't blinded, so the interviewer knew who you were, they knew your background. Typically, the interviewers were more senior partners, senior managers, that sort of level. And therefore, the cases as well were a bit more creative, I found, generally. It's a small sample size, but generally, and that was very enjoyable for me. One of those, for example, we were having a really interesting discussion about life sciences, where the future of the sector is, what we were thinking, and we decided not to do the third case study. We just thought, let's just keep talking, and that's what we did for that interview instead, and that was the firm I ended up accepting the offer from, because I really enjoyed connecting with them. And so it was only those 2 final rounds which I attended. By that point, I decided which offer to take, so it was only a small number of those ones. And
sorry, Harry.
Perhaps if I circle back around to those tests and sort of resources around there. So resources for tests, some of them I found were quite tricky. There's really quite a range. Some companies, they were fairly basic, and others, they were really quite difficult. And I found the time pressure was the major part. Basic levels of mathematics and reasoning, just GCSE level, as everyone will say. But you have to be confident in it. And I think that confidence is the key thing to get. So for that, I used the Thinking Skills Assessment practice books. That was really useful to go back through, and a lot of those questions come up again. Case Coach had some practice drills, which were useful for maths. But I think one of the most useful things was practicing with friends or people that I didn't know under pressure, and that really showed me where I was perhaps less confident. And say long division was something I'd always be struggling a little bit more to do without a calculator. So, so that was very helpful. And company specific resources were useful. Typically, before the test, they'd send examples of the questions they were going to ask, and those were invaluable to know what I was going up against, particularly when time was a big constraining factor. And the other part for resources I can perhaps talk about, if you like, is the resources for cases and for behavioural interviews, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, I think the case interview sits slightly separate to that numerical part. So we'll chat about that in a second, because I think that's such a bigger box to open, isn't it, the case interview? But I do think you've picked up on some really useful points there, which is actually sometimes where I see candidates make mistakes in their preparation, actually particularly numerate students, is they don't value the pressure so much that, you know, when you've got somebody watching you or you've got a time limit on, sometimes all sense can go out the window. And those things that we learned long time ago, that we feel would be so easy, even if we use maths every day, can really feel pressurized. And actually sometimes, because you're using them in such a different context perhaps to the subject that you study, or how you're used to using them, so that drilling, I think, can be very important.
I'm sorry. Some of the oh, sorry, I was going to
that's all right, we can come back to it.
Might be a part to edit.
Yeah.
There's something I thought I was going to say, but sorry, yeah.
No problem. So I think, yeah, that key thing is not underestimating the pressure. And I think something what I can hear there is you almost staggered your preparation for those tests from practicing from a book and revisiting some of your numerical skills, revisiting some test questions, doing some drills, and then escalating it up to actually then timing it and then working with other people. So that sounds to be like a useful plan, which is, don't kind of put yourself in front of an audience to do your maths straight away, but maybe build up.
Absolutely. So I make a note of when the deadlines were for each part, or when the test dates may be for each company, and that they're readily accessible online from websites and other collated resources. So I'd plan backwards and sort of ramp up my maths practice just to when those first maths tests were kicking in, and say I'd put my CV preparation, cover letter parts right at the beginning. But then with, say, interview preparation, that was more consistent throughout.
So you've mentioned that you kind of had a few interviews and you were interviewing at different types of firms, but even so all the way through the process, you're having to get across your skills and your fit with the firm. You're from a STEM background. How did you translate your skills from your study and employment to be relevant to the employer that you were hoping to kind of work with?
Yeah, so this was a bit difficult in some cases. So I can perhaps break it down into a few parts. For medicine, my primary degree, it was a little difficult sometimes, particularly with the generalist firms. Sometimes it was a barrier, I think. You'd have to overcome a bit of a hurdle of explaining why you were applying before starting the normal interview. Whereas for life sciences specific firms, it was normally quite a good point to connect on. Many interviewers had PhDs as their background, and they'd made a decision at some point that they didn't want to do academia and went into industry. So that was a good point to connect on, and a difference between those two types of companies. For medicine, though, leveraging the background and the skills from that was somewhat difficult. I think the interpersonal skills, some of the stories, some of the team working experiences were the key things to leverage and to bring up and reflect on. The hard skills, a little bit more difficult. Some were, say, an industry-specific knowledge, and that was useful for life science and healthcare firms, say, understanding of healthcare systems, stakeholders, etc. But that wasn't so applicable to the generalist firms. As their application processes were really quite standardized, there was no accounting for different people's backgrounds. It was all the same. Whereas for my master's degree, that was very focused on the business and science of therapeutic development, and that mapped very well onto applications. It was quite simple to translate those the experiences, the learning, the network into good applications. But probably the most useful part was outside of my degrees, in project work with societies. So Cambridge Consulting Network, Bridges for Enterprise, iTeams, and there are other ones available like Enterprise Tech and CapGrid and so on. Those were some of the most useful experiences to talk about, to reflect on, to discuss at interview, or pick out on my CV or cover letter. And to really show the impact and the application that I've had in my background. That was probably the most useful part to map onto the applications. The sort of the more interest part of my CV was sports, music, societies, etc. Was a bit more difficult to leverage, but it did come up a couple of times in interview, and perhaps I think looking back, I should have prepared a little bit more to sort of reflect and extract what would be most useful from those experiences.
It's interesting to hear how you thought about all of your experiences and how they relate. And I think that's a useful thing to do in your preparation, which is, what might this firm like to know about me? If you're going for a specialist firm like you have, and that's where you've ended up, of course, your kind of real specific kind of academic background is really very valuable, but there's also equal value for some firms in your extracurriculars. And that's actually sometimes what they want to hear about, because it is where you're choosing to be, right? Other than obviously the mandatory choice that you've chosen to complete your degree. So I think what you've said there, which is really unique actually, is you can look at all of your experiences as having value, but they'll have value in different ways. So look at who you're going to interview with when you're trying to pick your examples and pick your, what they might like to hear about you. So that's great advice. Other than your thinking about that categories of experience, were there any particular key details that you paid attention to from firms when you were applying to help you select where to go?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a list for this one. There are about 8 different parts which I typically consider with companies, and this would help me decide, say, which ones to shortlist to apply to, when to choose to apply to them, say the ones which are high up in my ranking earlier, and so on down the line, perhaps putting them in phases of applications. So to quickly run through them, the first one was researching what work each company did. Sometimes, particularly for the specialist firms, they'd focus just on market research or just on market entry, rather than on a broad area of work or something else. So that I found that useful to know about the different types of work, say strategy consulting versus other types. Secondly, the size of firms. I had a preference for larger firms. Moving from medicine, I wanted to go somewhere which I perceived as most stable and most set up for training. But others may choose more of a smaller firm for that startup feel. Thirdly, then the culture, and that again I think relates to the size, and I think it's particularly important for small companies to know the culture well. I've got friends who've gone off to smaller consultancy and they've loved it because they fit so well into the teams, and I think it's particularly important when the whole company is in that one office. The fourth thing was talking to employers. Talk to past employees and those at other firms, as we talked about before, really gave insight into how people enjoyed working there, what the working was like. For some firms, I hadn't realised that they'd a lot of work with America or in Asia, and that meant time zones for their life were a bit moved around, say very late evenings, very early mornings. So that was useful to consider. Fifth part would be the benefits. So normally, I wouldn't typically find the benefits and the long-term prospects from the company websites, but Glassdoor and other similar websites were useful for comparing based on that, such as say, salary from Glassdoor, or getting those details, say once there's an offer, and comparing it that way. Another part was then looking at the application process of each company, what was required, what tests they wanted to run, noting down the key dates, and also seeing how important referrals were for that firm. Some firms didn't put much importance behind referrals, others it was on the application form, and they put quite an emphasis on it. And about 7th or so, almost at the end of the list, would be looking at the job description of each company and of each role, and I'd change my CV and cover letter for each one of those, and I'd I'd note down key notes as well before each interview for what to think about as well. And the last part then was my general feeling through the recruitment process and through events and so on. So I continually revamped the companies as I was going through the recruitment process. And in the end, the company I went with, I hadn't heard of before I started applying, but they left a really positive impression through the recruitment process. I got on really well with all of the consultants I met. And so that general feeling then really changed the way I ranked the companies in the end.
I think that's so important, that intuition that you have when you're going to, even if you don't get to interview stage, although that is an excellent process, but when you go to events, when you contact people on LinkedIn and they get back to you and you have a chat with them, when you speak to people at the firm, looking at the work they do, if you feel excited when you're reading about it, or if you feel that you've built rapport with people, certainly through the interview process, that's, an excellent way to make a judgment about whether somewhere's right for you. So picking up on those cultural aspects is really important, because it has to be right for you, regardless of what the name is on the front door. To everybody else, that can be impressive, but you have to spend, perhaps 50 hours of your life there. So, and for some people, time zones, that's exciting to them and thrilling, and they want to be up or late, dealing with that. Other people, that's just not going to suit them. So it's not about where you should go, it's about what's right for you, that gives you, use your intuition, I think, is kind of what I've picked up as well about what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So now the big one, which we were just going to talk about, but I think is probably, if I had to rank it in the questions that I get asked, it's going to be number 2. The first is, where are the firms and what are the closing dates? But number 2 is, how do I prepare for case interviews? So, Harry, it's your turn to share with us. How did you prepare for your case interviews? And actually, were there any particular parts of your preparation that you thought would be a challenge and maybe had to plan to overcome them?
Yeah, so case interviews were very new to me when I was applying. So I had to go about first finding out what exactly they were. And there was advice all over the place for that. That was fairly easy. And really, I found the consensus was practicing about 25 case studies would give someone a very good grounding in what case studies were like. I know some people who've been very successful with less, but I think the more people do, typically the less variance there is, and more consistently they get through the interview stages, particularly as the first round interviews were increasingly standardized, I think, over Zoom, and increasingly blinded. So I try to aim for that, about over 25 by the first case interview, and then continue practicing right until getting an offer. And so I think there are a few different things here. Resources, I think, were key. Having a broad range of resources, I think, is really important looking back. I used Case Coach quite a lot, but which was great and really useful for getting feedback, since it was all on the scoring sheets and all written out clearly. But there was a bit of a lack of interviewee-led cases there. So going back, having a broad range of resources is key. I found some online university case booklets really useful. The Wharton Schools one had a very nice, diverse range of cases, some unusual ones, but which do come about, and it's nice to have to deal with that uncertainty and sort of slight panic when it's not something which is familiar. So those were all very, very helpful. And the key thing there, really, I found, was working with other students, working with consultants, working with people I trusted to practice under as close to interview conditions as I could, with very honest feedback, very constructive feedback, and that was really important for me. I think one thing I found out a little bit too late, or a bit later than I would have liked, was the role of confidence, actually. And I think sometimes practicing too much can then introduce a little bit of doubt. And so there's definitely something to be said for being able to go in very confidently, as I think that's a key part being assessed. You can find score sheets to see what's being assessed at case interviews, which are very helpful and insightful to see. And a large part of that is on communication, particularly confidence and how you're connecting to that interviewer, and really how well they feel you'd be able to present to a client, and for them to trust what you're saying. So I think those are some of the main things, really. In terms of, to answer your second question, the specifics, I think would be going back to the maths part, which I was worried about a little bit. So I can mention a bit about what I did there if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So I thought this would be a bit hard, and through my practice, I certainly found that was the part where I could be hit and miss. Sometimes it would go fine, but other times, if it was difficult, that could be where I tripped up and I lost my timing on the case. So perhaps under pressure with someone watching you over Zoom was very much needed and really helpful. And also doing those drills was helpful in between case practices. The technique I found most helpful, though, for doing the maths problems in these cases was to first talk through my approach in English with the examiner or the interviewer. And they'd ask perhaps to do X, Y, Z. I'd say, I'd clarify the question, just kind of repeat it and say what my understanding of it was in a very concise way. And then I'd say, I'd perhaps think for a couple of seconds and then say what my approach would be in English. So I'd say, I'd start by dividing X by Y. I'd segment it into these three parts. Then each of those I'll add a weighting to, such as this, this, and this. And then I will multiply this by that value, and I'll sum the results to give us our final value. Does that sound okay? And one gave me a bit of thinking time, and two allowed me to check that the approach was going to be okay with the examiner. And then from that, I'd keep talking throughout. I'd say, okay, I'll start doing the calculations. I'd say multiply, say 3,000 by 450, and then I'd say what the answer to that would be. And the advantage there was that you were still engaging the interviewer throughout that process rather than just going quiet for 3 minutes or so. And also any mistakes could be picked up very quickly. You wouldn't get to the end and have an answer which was way off, and you wouldn't really know then where to start, and neither would the interviewer. So talking through was really helpful, and the feedback I got that was a good approach to be doing. Even when I'd say slip up on something, it was much easier to recover if I did it that way.
I think what's important there is two things. The first is, it's not a vacuum. It is a kind of conversation. Cases are conversations. And the second is particularly perhaps this feedback for a virtual environment where it's not as easy visually for an interviewer to be seeing what you're doing, quite simply. So it allows you to build that rapport, but also it just gives them some eyes on what you're doing. And what's important, I think, with cases, and the biggest misconception is you have to be perfect all the time. The point is they're looking for your potential to be able to do this. Otherwise, they'd just be hiring experienced consultants. So they're looking for your potential and for you to talk through what you're doing, to seek consultation yourself. So if you give them a chance to help you, it's likely they will. Now, listen, if you keep going wrong and you're making very glaring errors and you just really can't get a grasp on it, maybe it's not for you at that point. But there's a little bit of conversation is not a bad thing, because rarely do consultants ever work completely on their own in a vacuum. So I think it's about, what I've picked up from you there is that conversation is not a bad thing, but you still need to have a good grip on what you're doing. It allows you to control the pace actually as well, doesn't it, if you're explaining things to your interviewer?
Absolutely. I think it was. I think that was an approach I found very useful. And picking up on something you said in terms of things will go wrong, and they inevitably do in one case or another. I found, or getting a bit overwhelmed at some point, I found it useful to have a phrase I'd go to try and buy myself a little bit of time and just step back rather than going down a rabbit hole. Sometimes I'd have to say, okay, if I'll just step back for a moment and look at this again. And I found sometimes if I was getting too focused on a detail, that would help me step back, look at the bigger picture again, and just buy myself a couple of seconds to get back on track, which came up a couple of times and was helpful.
Yeah, that's good advice. Did you have any, you sound like you've prepared so thoroughly, whether there's always going to be things you can't control. Did you have any unexpected experiences that kind of really took you aback?
So there were a couple. I would say that the majority of things companies had been quite transparent on, which was reassuring. I was a bit worried about that going into it, hearing so many different things on so many different people, particularly from companies trying to sell resources to students. But really the information was largely out there. And I think going back, I try and use that as a source of confidence, knowing what's happening. A couple of things though, which did surprise me. The screening tests, some of them were more difficult than I thought, and sometimes they'd try and give you information overload, I think, and really test how you can deal with 7 paragraphs of information for one question, and how you deal with your time. So that was a little surprising. Also, the first round interviews being blinded took me by surprise a little bit. It had a different dynamic than when I'd been practicing with people who knew something about me, or perhaps I'd established some more rapport with. But going into an interview and the interviewer being completely blinded as to my background was a little strange at times, particularly when it's a very standardized case and it was just hello, and then you're going straight into it. So that I think that tripped me up a little bit. So that was, I think, worth considering. And finally, one of the final round interviews involved a group case, which I hadn't practiced, but I'm sure for university, most courses will have group projects and things like that, society work. So I just took the normal approach and just tried to work well in a team, and that was fine.
I think you've picked up on something really, really important. And that is, there can be a lot of talk about getting into consultancy, how hard it is, how much pressure it is, how much preparation you have to do. A little bit like applying to Oxbridge or MIT or another leading university. There's a lot of pressure there. And what that means is there's a lot of people that proclaim to be able to help you if you're willing to part with your money. And to get you to do that, they make it sound really tough and as if you can't do it without them. But so, my advice is, there's a lot that the firms will really help you and coach you through the process as much as possible. But always, don't feel that pressure. I think is the most important thing. Is there's a lot of free resource. The service certainly helps you to the extent that we can, but there's also the consulting networks, the societies, and the employer events and the case workshops. There's question banks online and all sorts of things. So I would really like to give that as a health warning, which is there's actually not a real kind of pay your way to get smarter with these things. Actually, what I've picked up from you, but actually every single person I speak to who gets an offer with a good firm it's just hard work. It's just the work that you put in and the self-evaluation that really makes it better. I mean, what's your view there? Do you think there's anything kind of a magic wand you could have waved, or do you think that it really is about the work?
No, I think I think some. I certainly have friends who've been able to go through the process and get a good offer with much less preparation. And I think I went for as much preparation as I could fit into my schedule to really maximise the chance of getting the job I wanted, reduce that variance. But I mean, that's not absolutely necessary at all. But I think, yeah, more practice, more familiarity, being okay with what's typical, and that confidence, I think, all add to the chances of success. Particularly when you're dealing with such large numbers of applicants, there's always going to be some variance and bad luck in there. So I think everything to increase those chances is worthwhile. Just, you know, a bit of work over a few months, and then I think it pays off.
Do you have any, out of everything we've talked about there, Harry, which has been so valuable, do you have any, if you had to kind of consolidate your advice, what's your key messages for those people that are looking to secure interviews?
Right. So I suppose a number of key things. The first, I suppose, I'd talk about would be experiences. Trying as much as possible for your own sake, as well as for applications, to have experiences of consulting if you can. Internships are ideal, but I wasn't able to have the time to do one. I worked on these volunteer consulting projects with societies, and these were great. That really consolidated for me that this is the work I wanted to do, and that gave me confidence going into the applications, knowing that I was really doing something that or really applying for something that I want to do. And it gave me great experience to talk about at interviews, and in my CV as well, to get an interview. Secondly, that with the CV and the cover letter and the test, the screening processes, as we've talked, I think using all the resources available is really key. And one additional thing I'd say is preparing a CV a bit earlier than you plan on applying would be important, particularly if you're going to be asking for advice from people that you don't know personally. Then it helps. Often you'll be asked for a CV before you have a call with them, and it's very helpful to have a good CV that you can then send over, and they can then take you a bit more seriously, and they can see how they can help you. And sometimes that will then mean that's the CV they forward on to HR for you, or they pass on to one of the other consultants to say, let's have a look at this person's CV in more detail. So I'd prepare a CV a little bit further in advance. And the last thing would be company-specific things. Again, talking to those individuals at companies, getting their insights, perhaps what's the best way of applying to the company. For life sciences, for example, sometimes it wasn't the graduate route, sometimes it was a specific opening they had available, and that was useful to get from talking to employers. And really, that company-specific knowledge of their recruitment process, what they value, what they're going to ask you, what their culture is, that was really helpful. So those would be the three main things. There's experiences, your application documents, and preparation, and the company-specific things.
Great. Excellent. Really great to hear it in those terms, and starting early, I think, is absolutely key. Harry, thank you so much for sharing everything that you've told us. Did you have any final words of advice you wanted to give?
So there's just two things. What the second part is much shorter. The first one, I'd just say about the non-case interviews, the behavioural interviews. I think that's something which is easy to overlook, to prepare for, but I think it was really useful for me to prepare for, particularly after I'd gone to a couple of interviews and not got through to that final round from them. I then practiced with someone who was in HR and in recruiting, and it was very helpful to hear their advice, which was really to keep your answers very short. 30 seconds, 30 to 60 seconds maybe for a story. You want to be concise, structured, perhaps using a STAR technique or something, but still conversational, but concise, structured, authentic, and confident, and have your key phrase there and your high impact points to sort of summarize it and to round it off, say this was my impact in a quantitative term. And that changed the way that I was talking at interviews. I think it really shortened my stories. In a less normal way than one would have a conversation, but a much more interview appropriate way.
Mm.
And then the second bit of advice, the final piece of advice I'd have if I was giving it to myself 8 months ago or so, is that the recruitment process is very much a two-way thing. I think it's really important when you're going through to be thinking how much you like that company. How do you like their process, the people you've talked to? Do you feel really under pressure and like you've not been communicated well with? I think that says something about what it would be like to work at the company. And conversely, for the companies which communicate really well and connect with you perfectly, interview, and you just come out of them feeling happy and that you'd want to work there, I think that's really important as well. That the company I ended up choosing to work at was not the one I thought I would be aiming for at the very start, but I connected really well with all the interviewers, so that's the one I went with. So I think it's a two-way thing, the application process, that they're assessing you, but also you're assessing them, and you want to make sure you're working at the right place, genuinely for you, not for someone else, the right place for you.
That's great advice and a good place for us to leave it, Harry. Thank you so much. I'm glad we've been able to bottle up that information before you head off into your new career. Harry, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it, sharing your advice at the end of this journey that you've been on. And please do, keep in touch and let us know how you get on. To anybody listening, if you've been inspired by what Harry's talked about, you can visit the resources that he's discussed there from the Consultancy A to Z page, and also there's some special guides on our digital resources page, as well as, of course, the videos that I mentioned at the beginning. Harry, a huge thank you to you. We shall, as we do in the virtual world now, wave and say goodbye to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah,